Hey guys, tonight we're heading to a time when jobs were, well, a little messy, like truly dirty. Forget your typical 9 to 5. Imagine having a job that forces you to wade through human waste, not to mention the smell. Welcome to the bizarre and often unsung roles that made medieval Europe tick. Jobs so outlandish, you'd probably never make it. And speaking of probably, this one, you definitely won't survive this job. Just saying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop where you're tuning in from and the time of day it is in your neck of the woods. I'm curious how far across the globe we're stretching tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with one of the most thankless and foul jobs out there, the job of the Gong farmer. Imagine it. You're walking down a dirt path late at night, the moon hanging low in the sky, its pale light barely cutting through the fog. The air smells faintly of damp earth, but it's not the fresh kind of earthy smell. No, this is something worse. You're carrying a shovel, your only companion, the flickering lantern in your hand. This is your life now, and your task? To scoop out the contents of cesspits, those disgusting holes in the ground where people threw everything from food scraps to human waste. Now, these Gong farmers didn't exactly advertise their job as glamorous. In fact, they were often the bottom of the social totem pole. If you're wondering, yes, it was a stinky job. But before you turn up your nose and walk away, here's the twist. They were actually essential to keeping towns from drowning in filth. These farmers, who worked mainly in the dead of night, scooped out excrement and muck, carting it away for disposal, often dumping it into rivers or onto nearby fields, which, surprisingly, could be used as fertilizer. You'd think that would have been a job no one wanted, and you'd be right. It was filthy, but without it, cities could collapse into unsanitary chaos. Historians still argue whether these workers were just looked down upon, or if they were seen as necessary evils, sometimes even performing a role that bordered on respected. Were they at the very bottom of society, or did their jobs hold a strange, respected purpose? Maybe even a faint air of professionalism in a dirty job? The conditions weren't much better. Let's get into the specifics. There were no masks or gloves, no sanitation, no breaks. The stink would have been unbearable. Imagine standing in a confined space with only your shovel and the overwhelming, gut-churning odor of human waste. So yeah, not a job you want to show up to every day. But these workers were the ones who kept the streets from turning into open sewers, a huge health risk for everyone. Ironically, their work may have saved more lives than it cost. What's even stranger is the whole social perception thing. You might expect Gong farmers to be viewed with disgust, and they often were. But in a sense, these individuals had a certain power. They held knowledge about the inner workings of homes and towns, secrets people would rather not think about. And honestly, in the world of medieval sanitation, that kind of knowledge was essential. Historians also have a fun debate over whether the job of Gong farming was mainly filled by the lower classes because it was the only work they could get, or if the work itself became some sort of informal rite of passage for those who wanted to avoid more dangerous or physically strenuous tasks. Kind of like the lesser evil of medieval labor. Despite their essential role, though, Gong farmers were rarely mentioned in official records. The work was gross, and no one wanted to be associated with it. You don't exactly tell your friends, I'm a Gong farmer, after all. And yet, in the grand scheme of things, their work was one of the first rudimentary forms of public health. So, next time you're trying to avoid chores, just remember, you could have been stuck with a shovel, slogging through someone's literal waste. Still, as disgusting as it sounds, their work might not have been as lowly as we once thought. There were no modern toilets back then, no sanitation systems. These workers were saving lives, even if no one cared enough to thank them. What's even more fascinating, the Gong farmers' most important asset was their ability to work discreetly. That's right, these workers didn't just shovel muck and dump it. They had to sneak around town, working mostly in the dead of night. Can you imagine it? Silent, with only the lantern flickering beside you, carrying around buckets of waste under the cover of darkness. all while avoiding the occasional encounter with the local townsfolk who might just kill you for the smell. This, oddly enough, gave the job a certain mysterious aura. To the villagers, they were like phantom workers, coming and going, performing a job they didn't dare speak about. And yet, it had to be done, because without them, well, history shows that unsanitary conditions are a quick ticket to disease outbreaks. And we all know how well that went for medieval Europe. Without the Gong farmers, towns could have become breeding grounds for infection. A pretty grim thought, but crucial for the survival of society. Let's linger here for just a moment longer before moving on. Think about how much we take sanitation for granted today. The job of the Gong farmer might seem primitive, even horrifying, but in a strange way, it was a pivotal step in the evolution of modern waste disposal. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and that's what mattered. So, while you might never want to be caught in the shoes of Gong farmer, at least they were able to make a living, albeit with a very, very poor reputation. And as for us today, well, we can breathe a sigh of relief that we've got much better solutions for dealing with waste. Unless, of course, you're one of those people who still insists on using those weirdly scented organic soaps. But I digress. Okay, now that we've tackled one of the most unpleasant jobs in medieval Europe, let's move on to something that sounds slightly less disgusting, but still pretty strange. The knocker-upper. Yes, you read that right. This wasn't just some charming, old-timey job where people went around tapping on doors for a casual chat. No, these folks were literally your medieval alarm clocks. Picture it. It's the middle of the night, and you're in bed, wrapped in thick wool blankets, trying to get some much-needed sleep after a long day. Your head sinks into the pillow, and just as you're starting to drift off, you hear it tap, 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 right against your window. The sound is rhythmic, persistent, and it cuts through the peaceful silence like a clockwork soldier on a mission. You groggily roll over, wondering what kind of weird, annoying dream you're having, only to realize it's not a dream. It's someone knocking on your window to wake you up. Yep, your medieval knocker-upper has come to do their job. These workers were the unsung heroes of a world without alarms. They were hired to make sure people didn't sleep through their responsibilities, whether it was a trip to the market, work at the mill, or a royal announcement. These nighttime guardians would roam the streets, knocking on windows, doors, or even using a long pole to tap the windows of the upper floors of houses. No snooze button, no 5 more minutes. They had one job, and that was to get you up, whether you liked it or not. Now, here's the fun part. Knocker-uppers didn't just walk around with their bare hands tapping at windows. Oh no. They had tools like long sticks or poles with something at the end to reach those hard-to-reach upper floors. Some even used small hammers, while others made use of other oddly specific methods to get people's attention. And if the town was big enough, you could have a whole team of knocker-uppers working in shifts to make sure no one ever missed their wake-up call. Can you imagine? A whole team of professional alarm clocks, quietly going about their work under the cover of night. Historians still argue about the true significance of this job. Were these folks simply the human equivalent of alarm clocks, with nothing more to their job than a basic service? Or was there something a little more profound to it? Some people suggest that the job itself played into a larger social structure. The knocker-upper wasn't just waking people up, they were part of a larger system that ensured productivity in society. After all, if you missed your day's work because you overslept, that could mean a loss of income for you and potentially your whole family. So, in a sense, the knocker-upper wasn't just about personal schedules. They were part of the gears that kept the medieval economy turning. Here's the thing, though. The advent of the Industrial Revolution and, more importantly, the alarm clock meant that this job became obsolete. Once clocks became more widespread and personal, people began waking themselves up, and eventually, the knocker-upper faded from the scene. Imagine how weird it must have been to hear a bell ringing through the streets for the last time, marking the end of an era. The job had served its purpose, but society was shifting into a new age, where technology and personal responsibility replaced the human touch. But even though this job is gone, there's a strange sense of nostalgia around it, isn't there? A world where someone else was responsible for your mornings, gently dragging you out of sleep, might sound comforting in a way, like being looked after even by a stranger. Maybe there's something a little romantic about that in a world where everyone's rushing around with alarms blaring and no time for quiet moments. Perhaps in some alternate universe, we'd still be hiring knocker-uppers, strolling through the streets at dawn, knocking on windows and greeting us with that strange rhythmic tap. In fact, let's take a moment to think about this. What if we did still have knocker-uppers today? Imagine how much more peaceful the mornings would be. No buzzing phones, no shrill alarms. Just a soft knock at your window. Maybe even a little light-hearted chat before the start of your day. But then again, maybe we're too used to the jarring sound of our modern alarms to appreciate the gentle taps of a knocker-upper. Looking back, though, it's amazing how something so simple became such a necessity. Their job, which seems almost comical by today's standards, was once a crucial service. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that it's not just a quirky medieval oddity. It's a reminder of a world that was less automated, where humans performed tasks for each other that seem so strange now. So, as you get cozy in bed tonight, you might want to take a second to think about how lucky we are to have snooze buttons and the luxury of catching a few extra Z's. And just remember, if you ever miss an alarm in the future, you can always imagine a friendly knocker-upper giving your window a tap in the middle of the night. All right, we've just encountered one of the more peculiar, if somewhat charming, jobs in medieval life, the knocker-upper. But if you think that was the weirdest role, just wait until we meet the leeches, or more specifically, the people whose job it was to gather them. That's right. Let's talk about the leeches and the people who risked life and limb just to collect them for medicinal purposes. Now, you might be thinking, wait, aren't leeches those creepy little creatures you find in muddy ponds, clinging to your leg while you're out on a hike? And yes, that's exactly what they are. But in the Middle Ages, these squirmy, slimy creatures were seen as medical marvels. Doctors didn't have the benefit of modern science, antibiotics, or an understanding of bacteria. What they did have was leeches, which were believed to be the cure-all for almost any ailment. Need to balance the humors in your body? Leeches. Got a fever? Leeches. Headache? Oh, guess what? Leeches. So, who would go out into the wild, looking for leeches? You could almost picture them as medieval treasure hunters, but instead of searching for gold, they were after these squishy, blood-sucking creatures that could bring relief to the sick. Leech collectors were, to put it plainly, a necessary part of the medieval healthcare system, even if their job involved a fair amount of gross. You might find yourself asking, how did they actually gather these leeches? Well, it wasn't as easy as just dipping a bucket into a pond. No, these collectors had to wade into water, sometimes up to their knees, and wait for the leeches to latch onto them. It wasn't like they were out there gently scooping leeches up with a net or anything. No, this was hands-on work. Sometimes they had to rub certain areas of their body with muddy herbs, or even use bait like chickens, which, when lowered into the water, would attract leeches, who'd then latch onto the poor birds. After that, the collector would carefully remove the leeches and place them in jars for transport. But the most terrifying part? The leech harvest wasn't just about leeches. No, these collectors were often working in swampy, disease-ridden areas, surrounded by all sorts of unpleasantness, including malaria-carrying mosquitoes and other parasites. It was dangerous work. In fact, many leech collectors became infected themselves, exposing them to the very diseases they were trying to treat. But the practice of bloodletting was so ingrained in the medical world that the job continued, even as it became increasingly hazardous. Imagine working in those swampy, muggy conditions, trying to gather leeches, all for the sake of making a few extra coins. It was a job where the risk of illness was ever present. Here's where it gets even weirder. Let's talk about how these leeches were used in medical treatments. Medieval doctors, without the luxury of modern diagnostic tools, relied heavily on the idea that illness was caused by an imbalance in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of any of these was thought to lead to disease. And in the eyes of medieval medicine, the best way to balance the humors was to drain some blood. Yes, leeching was believed to literally purge the body of excess blood, restoring balance and health. To get a clearer idea of the process, let's imagine you're a patient in medieval Europe. Maybe you're feeling a bit off, maybe your head hurts, or maybe you're experiencing fever chills. You go to see the local barber surgeon. More on that later. And after a quick examination, the diagnosis is clear. Your humors are out of whack. The solution? A session with leeches. You might sit back as the leeches are placed on your skin, where they'd latch on and start sucking away, their little bodies becoming bloated with your blood. Sound delightful, right? The whole process was believed to be therapeutic, even though we know today it was mostly a placebo. But at the time, it was as medically sound as anything else in the medieval world. Historians still argue about just how effective leeches really were. Some believe that they may have worked by stimulating circulation, while others claim that they did nothing at all, and bloodletting was mostly just a way for doctors to feel like they were doing something, even if it was futile. The medical community back then wasn't exactly known for its precision. Remember, these are the same people who believed in humors and thought that smelling foul odors could cure diseases. But what's fascinating is how deeply ingrained these practices were in medieval society. The belief in the power of leeches lasted for centuries, long after we'd discovered better, more effective treatments. The most interesting part of the leech collector's job wasn't the leeches themselves, though. It was the role they played in the larger medical system. In a time when knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary at best, the leech collector provided doctors with one of their most important tools. And though their job may have been dangerous and disgusting, without them, the medieval medical system would have had one less thing to rely on. If we're being honest, though, the job of a leech collector was unquestionably strange. In modern times, we'd probably label it a bizarre side gig, fit for a Halloween story or a science fiction plot. But in the Middle Ages, it was deadly serious business. There were actual people risking their lives to harvest creatures that would then be placed on the skin of other people to suck out blood. And if you weren't careful, you could end up with more than just leeches. The swampy, murky water was also home to bacteria and other parasites, some of which would make their way into the blood of the very people they were trying to cure. It was, to put it mildly, a high-risk job. And yet, despite the inherent danger, these leech collectors were essential to the medical landscape of the time. Without them, the practice of bloodletting would have ground to a halt. And while the job may have been dangerous, and perhaps even a little absurd, it represents just how far people were willing to go for the sake of health, at a time when survival was often a matter of trial and error. Next time you get a scratch or feel a little under the weather, take a moment to be thankful for modern medicine, and definitely for antibiotics. And maybe, just maybe, think twice before you complain about a visit to the doctor's office. All right, after that delightful dive into leech collecting and medieval medical advancements, let's now talk about another job that is completely different, yet just as crucial to keeping the wheels of medieval society turning. Hot ketcha. You might be thinking, wait, that's an actual job? And yes it was. The rat catcher was not just some random guy with a broom chasing rats around the alleyways. No, they were the official rodent exterminators of the medieval towns, facing a very real, very serious issue: disease. Picture this. You're living in a bustling medieval town. The streets are narrow, the houses crowded together, and there are no trash collection services or garbage bins like we have today. The smell of uncollected refuse and human waste lingers in the air, and the streets are often filled with rats. It's not just an annoyance, though. These rats carry diseases, most famously the bubonic plague, or Black Death, which wiped out a massive chunk of Europe's population during the 14th century. So, let's talk about the job of the rat catcher, a role that involved more than just chasing rodents. Their work was vital to protecting public health, though, admittedly, wasn't glamorous or easy. Rats, carrying fleas, were one of the primary vectors for the plague. A single rat could infect an entire neighborhood, and if the rats weren't controlled, the disease spread fast. So, these rat catchers were tasked with keeping the population in check, not just for hygiene, but for survival. The methods they used to catch these rats were varied, depending on where you were. In some places, rat catchers would use traps, but often The most successful method involved a combination of hunting and poisoning. They would use rats' natural instincts against them, setting out bait or luring them into traps with food. Sometimes, they'd release specially trained dogs to help hunt the rats down, or they'd even employ the use of cats to do the job. Imagine that, medieval towns with professional cats on duty. This was not the cute, fluffy cat you think of today. No, this was a working animal, bred and trained to keep the rat population in check. These animals were worth their weight in gold, and in some places, rat catchers would be paid extra if their cats performed particularly well. And you thought your household cat just napped all day. No, medieval cats had a serious job. There were also reports of people using special poisons that would make the rats stop feeding, causing them to wander aimlessly until they dropped dead. This method wasn't foolproof. However, poisoning could sometimes take days to be effective, and during that time, the rats were still free to do their damage. It wasn't uncommon for rat catchers to have to track down a rat infestation on foot, carefully inspecting every corner of a building or alley to catch as many as possible. But what really made the job challenging? Rats were smart. They weren't just mindlessly running around. They learned to avoid traps, dodge poison, and outwit the human pest control system. The job required patience and skill. You had to know where rats were most likely to be hiding, and perhaps even more difficult, when and where to place your traps for maximum effect. Think about it. You're moving through the streets at night, crouching in alleyways, searching for the tiniest signs of movement in the dark. It was dangerous, dirty work, and required a level of tenacity that most people probably didn't have a stomach for. In fact, one of the most famous rat catchers was a man named John of Gadsden, a physician in the early 14th century, who was known for his rat-catching abilities as well as his medical expertise. But it wasn't just a job for the learned. Rat catchers were typically seen as folk heroes of sorts. In the midst of a plague outbreak, people would rely on them to keep the rats at bay and save lives. There's even a fun tidbit that the rat catchers would sometimes carry a specific whistle or bell so that townspeople would know they were around, and probably so that they could avoid the rather unpleasant smell of rat carcasses. But here's the most chilling thing of all. Rat catchers weren't just battling rats. They were battling the spread of death itself. The plague was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, and rats were some of the primary culprits in spreading the disease. The rat catchers, in their own strange way, were fighting an invisible war, a fight that required not only physical strength and strategy, but also a deep understanding of the biology of the rats, their behaviors, and their movements. And the irony? While rat catchers were doing their best to protect people from one of the deadliest diseases of the medieval world, they too were vulnerable. In a world with so little medical knowledge and so many dangerous diseases, the very people trying to prevent the spread of the plague were at risk themselves. They could catch the disease just as easily as anyone else, meaning their job had the potential to be just as fatal. Historians still argue whether rat catchers were truly appreciated in their time. Did the average person view them as unsung heroes, brave warriors protecting the town from the terrible plague, or did they see them as mere laborers, another layer of society's unsung workers? It's hard to say, since much of medieval life is shrouded in mystery. What we do know, though, is that their role was critical during one of the most devastating periods in European history. What's even more intriguing is that the job of rat catcher persisted for centuries after the medieval period. While we no longer rely on individual rat catchers in the same way today, their role evolved into the broader field of pest control that we know now. And in some parts of the world, there are still people who professionally deal with pest infestations. And yes, even today, some of them use the same tools and techniques that medieval rat catchers employed. So, when you next see a rat scurrying by or hear about a local pest control service, remember that there were medieval folks who did the same thing, not just to prevent an infestation, but to save lives in the face of a deadly, unstoppable plague. Now that we've covered the brave and often dangerous job of rat catching, let's dive into a slightly more vocal role in medieval society, the town crier. If you think about the role of the town crier, imagine someone standing in the middle of a square, bells clanging, voice booming, trying to capture the attention of everyone around. It wasn't just about announcing the news. It was about commanding attention. In the absence of newspapers, radios, or social media, the town crier was the communication lifeline for a community. And it was, without a doubt, a crucial role in a world where information spread much slower than it does today. So, picture it. The day starts early in a medieval town, and there's a chill in the morning air as people go about their daily routines, tending to livestock, working in the markets, or heading to church. Then, suddenly you hear it, a loud, commanding voice cutting through the bustle of the streets. Oh yes, here ye. The cry echoes through the square as people stop and look up, knowing it's time for the latest news from the ruler, the town council, or even the church. Whether it was a new law, the arrival of a visiting noble, or an announcement about the weather, the crier was the person who would let the people know. But what does it really mean to be a town crier? In a time when not everyone could read, the crier's job was absolutely vital. These were the people who made sure that everyone, rich or poor, heard about important matters, whether it was local news or royal decrees. The town crier's job was to ensure that no one in the community was left in the dark. And let's not forget, this was a job that required a certain amount of charisma. After all, you had to have a loud, clear voice to capture attention in the bustling, noisy streets of a medieval town. Interestingly, the job wasn't just about reading from a scroll or announcing news in a droning tone. A skilled crier had to put on a bit of a performance. They'd make sure to have the right cadence, using a particular rhythm that could hold the attention of their audience. In some cases, they even had to be somewhat theatrical, performing their announcements like they were actors on stage. It wasn't just about the words they said, it was the how that mattered. Town criers were performers as much as they were messengers. Here's where the job gets even more fascinating. The crier didn't just stand there and recite news. They had special tools, too. Most notably, the bell, often carried by the crier to attract attention. It was a symbol of authority and could be heard from a distance. In fact, the louder the bell, the more important the announcement. In some cases, criers would even wear distinctive clothing, including special coats or sashes, so that townspeople would immediately recognize them as the official source of news. In a sense, the bell and the uniform acted like a medieval badge of legitimacy. But let's step back for a moment and think about the real power of the town crier. The person standing at the center of the square with the loud voice had a lot of influence over the people. After all, if you were the one announcing new laws, royal orders, or even gossip about a local scandal, you had the ability to shape public opinion in a very real way. In fact, some town criers were given the responsibility of relaying royal decrees, legal judgments, and even tax hikes, which could spark riots or protests if the news was unwelcome. So, while the crier's job might sound like a simple matter of reading, it was much more complex. With a single shout, a town crier could inform, entertain, or even stir up trouble in the streets. Historians still debate the level of power these criers actually held. Was their influence more symbolic, representing the voice of authority, or did they truly wield the power to influence social movements and public opinion? While some towns and cities had one official crier, others might employ multiple criers, each tasked with different parts of town. In larger cities, there might even be a network of criers who work together, ensuring that information spread as quickly and thoroughly as possible. But in many ways, the crier's role was deeply rooted in trust. The people had to believe that the information being passed along was accurate. Otherwise, their entire role would be undermined. And while it's easy to imagine a crier as the go-to source for all news, their responsibilities weren't limited to the serious stuff. In fact, some of their announcements were downright strange. They could be tasked with announcing local festivities, tournaments, or even telling jokes or riddles to entertain the crowd. Some criers were even known to include a bit of gossip, ensuring that their announcements would capture the attention of those who might not otherwise care about the latest town decree. It wasn't all business. Sometimes, the crier's role blurred into that of the town's social entertainer. But as with many medieval jobs, the town crier was slowly phased out as technology advanced. With the invention of printing presses and newspapers, the need for a loud, human voice became less important. The written word took over, and eventually, the loud, boisterous crier was replaced by quieter forms of communication. By the time the Industrial Revolution rolled around, and towns became cities, the role of the crier was all but obsolete. The voice of the town faded into the background, and modern communication systems stepped in. However, there's something strangely romantic about the idea of the town crier. Standing in the square, ringing his bell, and shouting important messages out to the masses. It's a reminder of a time when communication wasn't instantaneous, when people relied on one person to spread the news to the entire community. The crier was a link between the individual and the larger world, a voice that could echo across town squares, through narrow alleyways, and down winding streets. And even today, many places have retained the tradition of the town crier, often as a symbolic position rather than a necessity. Some towns hold competitions for criers, keeping the old tradition alive for tourists and local festivals, reminding us that in a world of constant digital noise, sometimes it's nice to hear a real human voice. So, next time you're scrolling through your phone or getting overwhelmed by a news feed full of notifications, take a moment to appreciate the loud, proud role of the town crier. In the days when news was delivered by the ringing of a bell and the strength of a voice. Now that we've explored the booming world of medieval announcements, it's time to dive into a job that combines morbid curiosity and the ancient world's thirst for exotic goods. Let's talk about the mummy unwrapper, a position you probably didn't even know existed, but that once played an intriguing role in medieval society. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was obsessed with all things ancient Egypt. The fascination with mummies, wrapped in linen and sealed in elaborate tombs, was at an all-time high. To many Europeans, the mummies were treasures, somehow mystical, filled with untold power, and representing an ancient culture that had long since disappeared. So what did they do? Well, much like modern-day archaeological enthusiasts, medieval Europeans began collecting mummies. But they didn't just look at them, they unwrapped them. Yes, you read that right. The job of the mummy unwrapper was to carefully, painstakingly tear open ancient Egyptian mummies to discover their secrets. The process itself sounds more like a bizarre, grim form of entertainment than something you'd expect from a medical or archaeological profession. As people got their hands on mummies, often through trade or looting, they hired specialists to perform the act of unwrapping. The idea wasn't just to examine the mummies, but to experience them. There were parties, sometimes extravagant ones, where the goal wasn't just scientific curiosity, but more about showcasing an exotic spectacle for the elite. Imagine a scene. People gathered in a wealthy noble's grand hall, where a mummy is carefully laid out, its ancient linen wrapping laid out in precise layers, and a crowd eagerly watches as an unwrapper delicately peels it all away, revealing the preserved body within. Historians still argue whether these mummies were truly prized for their historical or medical value, or if they were simply considered curiosities. It's likely both. For the wealthy, mummies were considered luxurious artifacts. The unwrapper wasn't just performing a job, they were also performing a cultural ritual, one tied to the growing European fascination with Egypt. But here's where it gets weird. The ancient Egyptians didn't just mummify their pharaohs, they mummified everything. It wasn't just royalty who got the mummification treatment. Some very ordinary people had their bodies preserved for the afterlife as well. And if you were lucky enough to get your hands on a mummy, it wasn't just the noble ones you were likely to unwrap. It could be a commoner, an animal, or even a piece of mummified food. Yep, food mummies were a thing too. Imagine showing up to one of these unwrapping parties, only to discover your host is about to unveil a mummified chicken instead of a grand royal figure. The fascination didn't just stay within the upper classes, either. The trade of mummies grew so big that they were eventually shipped across Europe from Egypt, with some even making their way to Italy and beyond. As Egypt became a European fascination, so too did the desire for anything tied to it. The unwrapper was considered a skilled trade, someone capable of delicately removing layers upon layers of linen without damaging the preserved body inside. However, this task was a gamble. Once the linen was removed, the body could be in any state, sometimes perfectly preserved, but more often than not, the mummies had started to decompose, leaving a dusty, fragile mess behind. But that's not where the weirdness ends. In fact, the popularity of mummies became so intense that there was an entire market for mummy dust. Yes, you read that right. People believed that powdered mummy, when ingested, could cure all kinds of ailments. This led to a bizarre subjob within the mummy unwrapping profession. The people who ground up these mummies for medicinal use. Some people even believe that ingesting powdered mummy could prolong your life or cure diseases like epilepsy, headaches, and even plague. While we know now that it was completely useless and, frankly, dangerous, at the time, it was taken very seriously. If you could get your hands on some powdered mummy, well, you had a commodity that was in high demand. Historians still argue over the ethics of this practice. Were these unwrapper jobs part of a legitimate scientific curiosity, or were they nothing more than a gruesome trend? Some argue that the idea of unwrapping itself was driven by the romanticism of ancient Egypt, where European explorers and aristocrats saw the mummies as symbols of mystique, an invitation to uncover secrets from the past. Others say that it was more about spectacle than science. For them, unwrapping the mummies was like opening a mystery box. The thrill came from seeing something ancient and hidden and then sharing it with the public. What's even more strange is how, despite the often macabre nature of the job, mummies weren't always the prized relics they're considered today. In some cases, people treated them like trash. They were often used for strange rituals, burned as fuel, or sold in bulk to the highest bidder. In fact, there was a time when mummy unwrapping parties were such a regular occurrence that people started to grow desensitized to the shock of it all. The act of uncovering an ancient mummy and revealing its secrets became almost routine. It wasn't until much later, as archaeological standards evolved and understanding of ancient cultures grew, that the practice of unwrapping mummies was criticized. By the 18th century, as more careful study of Egyptian antiquities began, people began to realize that these bodies were not simply objects to be exploited for entertainment. Mummy unwrapping slowly died down as more scholars sought to preserve the dignity and history of ancient Egypt, treating mummies with more respect and studying them through non-invasive methods. However, what remains is the strange history of the mummy unwrapper, a person who played an essential part in the Western fascination with Egypt, revealing bodies that had been preserved for millennia, but not for the noble or respectful reasons we might expect. Instead, they were revealed for the thrill of the crowd, a bizarre curiosity for an age that had yet to understand the depth of the cultures they were fascinated by. So, the next time you see a mummy in a museum or movie, think about the long, winding road it took for that artifact to be preserved, and how, at one point in time, people were unwrapping these ancient treasures simply for sport, selling powdered remnants as cures, and turning history into a spectacle. It's a fascinating reminder of how human curiosity, often driven by spectacle, can sometimes blind us to the respect history truly deserves. All right, now that we've dealt with the mummy unwrapping oddities of medieval life, let's move on to a job that involves not only some serious sharp skills, but also a healthy dose of guts: the barber surgeon. Now, this title might sound a little funny today, but back in the Middle Ages, it was a necessary and highly respected job. The barber surgeon was a professional who didn't just trim beards. Oh no, they did way more than that. These multitasking experts had the dubious honor of performing surgeries, dental work, bloodletting, and even amputations. Let's break it down. When you think of a barber today, you probably imagine someone cutting hair, maybe giving a shave or a quick trim. But in medieval times, barber surgeons did much more than that. They were part of an early and somewhat crude form of healthcare. They were, in many ways, the jack of all trades of the medical world. A barber surgeon could perform a routine haircut by day and treat battle wounds, pull teeth, or even perform amputations by night. It wasn't uncommon for people to visit their local barber surgeon for a variety of health issues, and some of their procedures were pretty intense, considering the lack of modern tools at their disposal. Imagine this. You're a medieval commoner, and you've come down with a nasty fever. You could go to a local barber surgeon for a bloodletting, which was believed to balance your humors and treat everything from headaches to more serious conditions. Or perhaps you're dealing with a painful toothache. You'd head to the barber surgeon, who would grab their pliers and pull out your tooth, probably without any form of anesthetic, leaving you in excruciating pain. And if you were unlucky enough to have a serious injury, say from a battle or an accident, the barber surgeon might be the one to amputate a limb, all while using rudimentary techniques and tools that we wouldn't even think of using today. It wasn't an easy life. Barber surgeons had to be brave, and if they weren't, well, they probably wouldn't have lasted long in the field. The lack of modern medicine and antiseptics meant that performing surgeries often led to infection, and not just any infection, but life-threatening infections. People could die just from getting a wound treated, especially in battle. But for all the gruesome work they did, barber surgeons were still more trusted than other people in the medical profession. Why? Because they had the tools. While physicians were often too busy philosophizing about humors and giving out herbal remedies, the barber surgeon was doing something. The procedure itself could often be more effective simply because it was action rather than waiting around for something to happen. And let's not forget their amputations. Medieval wars, particularly the constant battles and skirmishes of the time, meant that injuries were often horrific. A sword strike or an arrow could leave a soldier with limbs in shambles, and the barber surgeon was the one to fix that. It sounds terrifying, but these barber surgeons were actually pretty skilled at what they did, even though the methods might make your stomach churn. You might have been in a battle where a sword cleaved through your leg, and in order to save you, the barber surgeon would have to saw through the bone with a crude, unsteady saw. They would tie off the wound, and with a bit of luck and pain, you might survive. But death from blood loss or infection was very common. So how did someone become a barber surgeon? Well, it wasn't like modern medical school. Barber surgeons were typically apprentices learning the craft from older, more experienced practitioners. They'd be taught the basics of anatomy, surgical techniques, and the more practical aspects of healthcare, like how to treat wounds, set bones, and perform bloodletting, the practice that everyone thought was the cure to most illnesses back then. The training could take years, and while it was often less formal than the education of physicians, it was still hands-on and involved learning on actual patients. Talk about real-world experience. And here's the twist. While these barber surgeons were busy saving lives in some ways, they were also responsible for some pretty questionable practices. For instance, bloodletting was believed to cure nearly everything, from fevers to melancholia. In reality, it was mostly harmful, often making conditions worse, especially when patients were bled multiple times. But in the absence of modern knowledge about germs, viruses, and bacteria, bloodletting seemed like a reasonable solution. Similarly, amputations, while effective in some cases, often led to death from infection. It's crazy to think how primitive these treatments were, but also fascinating to realize that many of them worked, just not in the way we'd expect today. Historians still debate how much credit the barber surgeon deserves in the context of medieval healthcare. On the one hand, they were often seen as practical professionals who got the job done in a world that lacked sophisticated treatments. On the other hand, some argue that they were simply performing dangerous acts that left many dead or seriously maimed. It's hard to say, but what's clear is that they were an essential part of medieval society. Without them, the risk of infection and death in battle would have been even higher. Without them, the common folk might have been stuck with little more than ineffective herbs or potions that did more harm than good. The real question, though, is whether their job would have been respected back in their time, or if people saw them as little more than glorified barbers with blood-stained aprons. The answer might depend on the individual barber surgeon's skills. Some were praised as miracle workers, while others were feared as quacks. But no matter the case, their profession existed in a world where the lines between barber and surgeon weren't so clearly defined, and the need for medical treatment far outweighed the safety of the procedures themselves. And here's a curious thing. The profession of the barber surgeon didn't just disappear after the Middle Ages. The transition from barber surgeon to professional medical practitioners happened slowly, and by the 17th century, barbering as a profession became distinct from surgery. The two roles gradually split, with barbers continuing their work in hair and grooming, and surgeons heading into more formalized medical schools. But for hundreds of years, these brave and sometimes unlucky individuals were on the front lines of medieval medicine, sawing, bleeding, and trying their best to keep people alive. So, next time you sit in a modern barber's chair or go to the dentist, take a second to think about the long and strange journey we've taken to get there. You might be getting a haircut now, but centuries ago, that same chair could have been where you had a limb removed or a tooth yanked out. Quite a leap, huh? Now that we've stepped out of the grisly world of barber surgeons, let's tackle another fascinating, yet disturbing, medieval job that might make you cringe a bit: the animal bleeder. Yes, you read that right. In medieval Europe, there were people who were responsible for bleeding not just humans, but animals too. And no, this wasn't a practice reserved for livestock either. This was a real job where the individual would go around performing bloodletting on everything from horses to cows to sheep. So, what exactly did an animal bleeder do? And why would anyone think it was a good idea to bleed their animals? The practice of bloodletting was based on the belief that diseases were caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And the solution? Drain some of that excess blood to restore balance. It's wild, right? And as strange as it sounds, bloodletting was performed on both humans and animals during the Middle Ages, as people believed that bloodletting could cure a wide variety of ailments in animals, including sicknesses, fatigue, or digestive problems. So, who exactly were these animal bleeders, and what kind of skill did it take to do this job? Animal bleeders were often farmers or herders who had learned the craft over time. They didn't have the scientific knowledge we have today about diseases, bacteria, or blood circulation. Instead, they relied on old medical traditions and the wisdom passed down from others in the community. Their job was to make an incision in the animal's vein, usually in the neck or leg, and then allow the blood to drain out. The belief was that this would restore the animal's health by purging it of bad humors or toxins. Let's pause here for a moment. Picture the scene. An animal standing in a barn, tied to a post, likely struggling or uneasy. The bleeder, armed with a sharp tool, carefully makes the incision and allows the blood to pour out. Not a pretty sight, right? Especially since this wasn't done in sterile conditions. No antiseptics, no gloves. The bloodletting was often done by eye, with the bleeder deciding how much blood needed to be drained from the animal. It was a rough job. Why animals, though? Why did the animal bleeder exist in the first place? Well, back in medieval times, animals were invaluable. They were essential for farm work, transportation, and food. Cows provided milk. Horses were used for riding and farming, and sheep were raised for wool. So, if an animal fell ill or was underperforming, its loss could mean disaster for a family. In that sense, it was a rational decision to perform bloodletting on these animals. But of course, that doesn't make it any less bizarre when viewed from a modern perspective. The most interesting thing about this job is that it wasn't just limited to farm animals. Exotic animals were sometimes subjected to bloodletting as well. Imagine this. You have a nobleman who's just returned from a trip to Egypt or the Middle East, and he's come back with a prized lion or exotic bird. These creatures, too, were bled by specialists, as the belief in the healing powers of bloodletting was so deeply ingrained that it didn't matter the species. The practice went beyond the barn and into the courts of the elite. Historians still argue about how effective bloodletting was in the case of animals. Did it actually do anything? Some animal bleeders might argue it had a positive effect, seeing improved health in their animals. However, others point out that the practice could be more damaging than helpful. The lack of hygiene and modern understanding of diseases likely meant that animals sometimes suffered as a result of the procedure rather than benefiting from it. It's also possible that some animals who survived the bloodletting did so by sheer luck, not because of any miraculous healing properties from the practice itself. As for the humans involved in bloodletting, they too could suffer from its dangers. The same unsanitary conditions that affected the animals also affected the bleeders. Without any knowledge of germs or infection, the animal bleeders' tools could easily become contaminated. This meant that the bleeder was just as likely to contract an infection as the animals they were treating. It was a dangerous line of work, and the risk wasn't limited to the physical risks alone. Imagine the pressure of performing such a delicate procedure. One wrong move could lead to the death of a valuable animal, and that might very well have meant losing your job or facing punishment for malpractice. The social position of the animal bleeder was also an interesting one. Unlike the barber surgeon, who held a certain level of respect in society, animal bleeders were generally seen as lower on the social scale. Their work was important, but it wasn't glamorous, and their methods were often questioned by others in the medical field. Despite this, animal bleeders were still necessary in communities where livestock was a vital part of the economy. In that sense, they were a crucial cog in the medieval agricultural machine, even if they were often looked down upon. Now, as much as we can look at the practice of animal bloodletting with a raised eyebrow and a sense of modern horror, it's important to understand that these medieval individuals were doing the best they could with the knowledge and tools they had at the time. They didn't have access to modern veterinary care or scientific insights. They simply used the methods they believed to be effective, often based on tradition, word of mouth, and trial and error. In the absence of antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced diagnostic tools, the methods may seem primitive, but they were all they had. As the centuries went by, however, animal bloodletting slowly faded away. The rise of modern veterinary science and the understanding of infection meant that this practice became increasingly obsolete. Today, we treat sick animals with antibiotics, vaccinations, and specialized care that wouldn't even be remotely imaginable to a medieval animal bleeder. But if we take a moment to reflect on this curious medieval job, it's a reminder of how far we've come in terms of our understanding of health and medicine. In a world where every day was a battle against disease and injury, the medieval people did what they could to save their animals, and, in turn, themselves. The legacy of the animal bleeder, though strange and sometimes gruesome, is part of the long history of human progress in medicine and the understanding of the living world around us. Next time you visit a vet or watch your dog get its yearly shots, take a moment to appreciate just how far veterinary science has come and how lucky we are not to be dealing with bloodletting as a form of treatment. Now that we've dealt with the quirky world of the animal bleeder, let's shift gears a bit and move into a job that, while still strange by today's standards, had a very different kind of impact on medieval life: executioners. But before you picture some silent, dark figure standing with an axe in the shadows, let's dig into the strange and somewhat paradoxical role that executioners played in medieval society. These are people who were responsible for delivering justice through death, but who in many ways lived lives marked by social stigma, isolation, and an odd sense of duty. Executioners weren't just criminals or murderers. In fact, they were often chosen for their profession, sometimes even coming from families of executioners. You'd think that in a society where killing was not only allowed, but required by law, executioners might have been treated with respect. Instead, the opposite was often true. Despite their importance in enforcing the law, executioners were among the lowest members of medieval society. They were feared, ostracized, and their jobs often put them in moral dilemmas. It wasn't uncommon for an executioner to live on the outskirts of town, away from the rest of society, because their role was so taboo. But why was this job so socially toxic? To the general populace, the executioner was a necessary evil, a figure who dealt with those who had been judged to deserve death. Whether it was a thief, a traitor, or someone convicted of a heinous crime, the executioner was the person who carried out the sentence. While this sounds simple enough, the problem was that executioners weren't seen as bringing justice. They were seen as performing an ugly, filthy task. And the public's discomfort with the act of execution translated into disdain for the person doing the job. No one wanted to associate with someone whose daily work involved blood, pain, and death. Imagine this. You're living in a small medieval town, and a criminal has just been sentenced to death. Everyone knows that the executioner will come to carry out the sentence, but no one wants to watch, and no one wants to get too close to the executioner. In fact, they would often have to wear distinctive clothing that marked them as part of this class of workers. The job came with a strange and awkward notoriety. They might not even have been allowed to participate in certain social events or religious ceremonies, as people feared that the presence of an executioner could bring bad luck or divine retribution. But here's the thing. Despite this social stigma, executioners were often incredibly skilled. They didn't just walk up and swing an axe. It was an art form in its own way. An executioner had to know how to perform a swift, clean execution, whether it was by hanging, beheading, or sometimes even burning at the stake. This wasn't the kind of work you could just jump into without experience. A poorly executed, no pun intended beheading, for instance, could lead to an agonizingly slow and painful death for the condemned person, and the executioner could face severe consequences for botching the job. It's easy to see how such a job would require nerves of steel, skill, and training. Because, just like the medieval barber surgeon, one wrong move could result in a much worse situation. Historians still argue whether the position of the executioner was one of total power or complete submission. On one hand, they had the power to end a life, carrying out sentences passed by the court or the king. On the other hand, they were often at the mercy of society's judgment and personal morality. Some executioners were known to have been deeply troubled by their work, even becoming alcoholics or suffering from severe depression because of the emotional toll it took on them. There are records of some executioners seeking counseling or spiritual guidance, hoping for absolution or a sense of peace after performing their grisly work. The personal toll, while rarely acknowledged by the public, was undeniably present. Interestingly, though, the job of executioner wasn't always a permanent one. In some regions, executioners could rise to fame or infamy and become rich through their role. The compensation was often substantial, and they might even receive a small piece of land or additional privileges as reward for their work. However, the social consequences were still difficult to escape. You could be wealthy and important in terms of your salary, but if you walked through the town square, people would still turn away and avoid eye contact. Some even avoided being seen in public at all, wearing disguises to go about their daily lives. It's also worth noting that executioners were sometimes required to participate in other roles, such as acting as torturers or interrogators. They might not only carry out the death sentence, but also be involved in extracting confessions from criminals, which often involve the use of physical pain. This dark dual role added to the moral complexity of their position. Being responsible for both the physical pain of the accused and their eventual death would weigh heavily on anyone, no matter how hardened they might become. But the interesting thing is that, despite the widespread social rejection, executioners were still essential to the functioning of medieval justice. In a time where the death penalty was the ultimate punishment for crimes ranging from theft to treason, the executioner was the only one who could carry out that ultimate authority. Without them, the law would have been powerless. So, in a strange and twisted way, the executioner was a cornerstone of medieval legal systems, carrying out the sentence and enforcing the law in ways that no one else dared to. Historians have long debated whether the work of the executioner had any real moral purpose or was merely about fulfilling societal demands. Some argue that executioners were simply tools of the legal system, while others suggest that they held an important moral responsibility in carrying out justice, even though their position was clearly a bitter and often mentally taxing one. One thing is for sure. The medieval executioner was more than just a figure in the shadows. They were an essential part of the fabric of medieval life, even if their job came with a heavy psychological and social price. When the medieval period began to fade and the modern justice system took shape, the executioner's job began to lose its mystique. With the advent of more formalized legal systems, executions became more regulated and moved away from the traditional hands-on approach. But for centuries, the executioner was a person who played a role in the complex interplay between law, justice, and society, a strange, paradoxical figure who embodied both power and shame. So, next time you hear about someone in the criminal justice system, take a moment to think about the historical figures who once played similar roles. Figures who were part of a system of justice that was often as brutal as it was necessary. And remember, the executioner's job wasn't just about swinging an axe. It was about living with the weight of life and death in a world that demanded both. As we move from the paradoxical life of the executioner, let's take a step into another unique and at times eerie medieval occupation, the corpse washer. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this just some part of the funeral process? A little ritualistic, but nothing too odd. Well, you'd be partially right, and yet also so wrong. While corpse washers were indeed a vital part of the death rituals in medieval Europe, their job was much more involved and significantly more significant than we might initially assume. In the Middle Ages, death was an ever-present companion, not just emotionally, but physically. Whether it was the plague, war, famine, or just the natural course of aging, the people of medieval Europe faced death constantly. And when a person died, it wasn't just a matter of laying them to rest. No, medieval customs called for elaborate rituals and preparations to ensure that the deceased made it to the afterlife. And this is where the corpse washers came into play. Their role was a critical part of this process. In the era before modern embalming and funeral homes, when someone died, their body needed to be thoroughly cleaned, dressed, and prepared for burial. A corpse washer was responsible for cleaning and washing the deceased's body, often preparing it for viewing, family rituals, or the actual burial. While it might sound simple, it was an intricate, sometimes lengthy, and very important process that involved both physical and spiritual components. At its core, the act of washing a dead body was seen as both practical and ritualistic. On one hand, it was a matter of hygiene. Just like today, we want to ensure that someone looks peaceful and presentable at their final viewing. But on the other hand, it was believed that washing the body helped cleanse the deceased of any last sins and ensure they were properly prepared for their journey into the afterlife. The body was washed with a special mixture of water and herbs, which was thought to purify and protect the soul of the departed. In some regions, the ritual might even include anointing the body with oils or perfumes, as it was believed that a sweet-smelling body could assist the deceased in being received favorably in the next life. But here's the thing. This wasn't a job you could do just by understanding cleanliness. The work of a corpse washer was laced with symbolism and cultural importance. They weren't just performing the role of morticians. They were also acting as spiritual caretakers. The job required knowledge of religious rituals, especially those of the local church, and an understanding of how to prepare the deceased in a way that conformed to spiritual expectations. For instance, in some cases, the body would be laid out with the head positioned eastward, as it was believed the person would rise again from the east on Judgment Day. Now, imagine this job for a moment. You, the corpse washer, are faced with cleaning a body, often someone you've known personally, maybe even someone who has passed from illness or disease. It wasn't just the psychological weight of it, it was the proximity to death itself. There's a certain level of respect and solemnity that must be maintained, but there's also a heavy emotional toll. Because in medieval society, death was not only a personal tragedy, it was also something that carried an element of danger. In a time when diseases could spread easily through close contact, handling the bodies of the dead carried serious health risks. The risk of catching something like the plague or tuberculosis was constant. The more infected the population was, the more crucial these rituals became. The corpse washer, though performing a vital service, was constantly at risk of contamination. The job wasn't just a simple act of washing either. It was also tied to the entire mourning process. After the body was washed and prepared, it was often dressed in the finest clothing available, sometimes with valuable accessories, to ensure the soul's comfort on its journey. The corpse washer was also responsible for the procession that led the body to its burial site, keeping the deceased in a state that allowed family members to bid a final, peaceful farewell. Some corpses were even laid in state for several days before burial, and it was the corpse washer's task to make sure the body was cared for during that time. Interestingly, the role of the corpse washer also had a degree of social mobility. The position was open to anyone, and in many places, it was seen as a necessary evil. While some corpse washers were respected for their role in preparing the dead for burial, many were considered low class or even tainted. The act of touching death on such an intimate level, often in the presence of families who were grieving, made it a difficult role to maintain socially. People would often distance themselves from those in the death care profession, even though their work was crucial. Historians still debate whether the role of the corpse washer was spiritually significant or whether it was just a grim, unappreciated job that people performed out of necessity. Some believe that corpse washers were seen as special people who helped bridge the gap between life and death, providing a sense of comfort to grieving families. Others point out that they were just viewed as dirty workers, people who lived on the outskirts of society, doing what no one else wanted to do. Regardless of the perception, though, their role in preparing the dead was essential. Without them, the dead wouldn't have been prepared for the afterlife, and the grieving families might not have had the closure they needed. As the centuries passed, the practice of corpse washing evolved. With the rise of more formalized funeral practices and the growth of funeral homes, the role of the corpse washer slowly became obsolete. Today, the idea of a corpse washer seems somewhat archaic, as modern funeral homes and morticians have taken over these duties. But still, we see echoes of the ritualistic nature of caring for the dead in our current practices of embalming and viewing. If you ever find yourself reflecting on the role of the corpse washer, consider this. The job may have been one of the most difficult, lonely, and dangerous jobs in the medieval world. But in a society that was constantly surrounded by death, it was also one of the most important. The corpse washer not only prepared the deceased for burial, they provided a service that allowed people to face death with a certain level of dignity and respect. Their work was an integral part of helping the living understand and accept the presence of death in their daily lives. And for that, their legacy still deserves recognition, even in today's modern world. Shifting gears from the solemnity of corpse washers, let's now delve into one of the more peculiar and definitely spirited professions of medieval Europe, the moonshiner. Picture this: the quiet hum of the countryside at night, the stars twinkling overhead, and deep in a secluded forest or behind a hill, someone is busy working with large copper pots and barrels, crafting a concoction that will make your hair stand on end. No, this isn't some dark wizard's potion. This is the world of moonshine, and it was a job, if you could call it that both fueled and endangered the medieval economy. In medieval Europe, brewing wasn't just a hobby for monks or the wealthy. It was a practical necessity. While beer was a staple drink, and wine was essential in regions with vineyards, the need for distilled spirits arose in an era where water wasn't always safe to drink, and preservation of food and medicinal purposes led to a demand for alcohol. Distilling alcohol, however, was an art, and it was far from a public, legitimate process. As one could imagine, moonshiners weren't exactly advertising their product. They worked in secrecy, away from the eyes of both the church and the crown, crafting their potent spirits often under the cover of darkness. Moonshiners were typically found in rural areas, living on the fringes of society. Their work required a knowledge of distillation that went beyond brewing a simple ale. Distilling alcohol to a high proof, what we today call moonshine, involved heating fermented grains or fruits, capturing the vapor, and condensing it back in a liquid form. The result? A highly concentrated, often harsh alcohol that was dangerous, intoxicating, and incredibly profitable. But while this illicit trade flourished, so did the risks, both in terms of the law and the health of the drinkers. Moonshine in medieval times was considered a form of rebellion. The alcohol itself, often distilled without proper oversight, could have disastrous effects on those who consumed it. The lack of proper regulation and purification meant that this alcohol often contained dangerous chemicals or impurities that could lead to poisoning, blindness, or even death. Yet, despite its dangers, there was a demand. It wasn't just about drinking for pleasure. People drank because it was safer than water, often contaminated with bacteria, and served as a social lubricant, much like alcohol does today. But why did this practice persist despite its obvious risks? Well, the medieval world was complicated. Alcohol in the form of beer or wine was commonly consumed by people from all walks of life. It was a daily part of life. But as the medieval period wore on and cities grew, the demand for stronger spirits began to increase. Local lords and monarchs, who controlled the flow of goods and taxed the public, didn't take kindly to moonshiners, especially when they were producing and selling alcohol without paying their fair share of taxes. Moonshiners were criminals, pure and simple, but in the rural areas, they were also seen as folk heroes or rebels, those who defied authority for the sake of keeping the people's spirits high and their bellies warm. They might not have been illegal by choice. They were forced into it by the strict controls over alcohol distribution imposed by authorities. In fact, some moonshiners were known for their resourcefulness. They often crafted elaborate still setups hidden deep in forests or caves, keeping their operations secret from law enforcement. They could make their alcohol in the dead of night, bottle it under cover of darkness, and then sell it in the local village, keeping a portion of the profits for themselves and providing a drink to the locals who needed it. They were often operating in competition with larger, more legitimate brewing operations, and their cheap, high-proof product was sometimes seen as more accessible to the common folk than the alcohol supplied by more official brewers. But as with all underground operations, there were consequences. Medieval authorities, from kings to bishops, took a dim view of moonshiners. They weren't just breaking the law, they were stealing revenue. If caught, moonshiners faced severe punishment, ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment or even execution. In some cases, moonshiners were forced to watch their stills and equipment be destroyed in public. Yet the practice of making illicit alcohol continued because demand was high, and the rewards, financial and social, were tempting. The thrill of evading the law only added to the allure of moonshining. Historically, the debate around moonshine often revolves around whether it was more of a necessity or a purely rebellious act. Some historians argue that moonshiners were simply responding to the restrictions placed on alcohol production by medieval rulers, who taxed alcohol heavily and restricted its sale. By making their own spirits in hidden stills, moonshiners were creating a parallel economy in a system that controlled everything from food to drink. Others suggest that moonshining was more a matter of greed or a simple desire for profit. Either way, it was a dangerous business, a tightrope walk between survival and punishment. As we move forward in time, you might be surprised to learn that the practice of moonshining didn't die out with the medieval era. It continued to thrive into the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in regions like Appalachia in the United States. The basic principles of distillation remained the same, though the legal landscape became more complex with changing governments and regulations. Moonshiners, just like their medieval ancestors, remained one step ahead of the law, crafting their spirits in secret and maintaining their subversive role in society. So, next time you crack open a bottle of whiskey or a strong spirit, take a moment to think about the long, illicit history of moonshine. It wasn't just about creating something to drink. It was about pushing back against authority, surviving in an economy that didn't cater to the lower classes, and making something potent enough to keep you warm during harsh winters. The moonshiner was part of a hidden world, one that ran parallel to official society and its rules, full of ingenuity, risk, and rebellion. Now, let's shift from the clandestine world of moonshiners to one of the more unsettling yet absolutely vital professions in medieval Europe, the plague doctor. These strange figures, decked out in their eerie bird-like masks, have become one of the most iconic symbols of the Black Death. And while they were part of an incredibly dark chapter in history, their role is not just about fear and death. It's also about the desperate lengths medieval society went to try and understand disease. The plague doctor wasn't just an observer of suffering. They were the ones standing at the front lines, trying to keep the plague at bay, even when they knew so little about how diseases spread. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, decimated entire populations, sometimes killing entire towns within weeks. The disease was unlike anything people had encountered before, and at the time, the most common explanations ranged from divine punishment to the anger of the gods. So, what did people do in the face of this invisible threat? They turned to their plague doctors who, although they had little to no real medical knowledge about infection, were the last line of defense in an era with no antibiotics, no vaccines, and very little understanding of germs. Now, when you think of a plague doctor, you probably imagine that grotesque mask with the long, curved beak. It wasn't just for looks, though. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs, like rose petals, cloves, and juniper. The belief was that these sweet-smelling herbs could ward off the bad air or miasma, which was thought to carry disease. In the minds of people back then, illness wasn't spread by germs because germs weren't even a concept yet. Instead, it was spread by foul-smelling air, which was considered to be a form of toxic vapors that could infect people with disease. So, these masks were essentially medieval air filters. The plague doctor's uniform was no less bizarre. They would wear a long coat made of waxed fabric, gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. All of this was designed to keep the doctor protected from the corrupt air. They carried a long staff as well, which was used to point at patients or direct them to stay away, especially when examining them. It's easy to imagine how terrifying they must have looked to the common folk, who were already gripped by fear of death and disease. But here's the real tragedy. The plague doctor, despite their odd appearance, was essentially powerless. The methods they employed to cure the plague were mostly ineffective, and many doctors became infected themselves. The profession was born out of necessity, but it was also one of desperation. The truth was that medieval society had no real understanding of what caused the plague or how to prevent it. While some early attempts were made at quarantine, most of the treatments used by plague doctors were rooted in superstition and primitive theories of illness. Plague doctors would often treat their patients with bloodletting, a practice that had been employed for centuries but was ultimately ineffective for treating infectious diseases. They'd also use potions and herbs, applying them to the body or administering them orally, hoping to cure or alleviate the suffering. Some of these treatments involved applying leeches, rubbing mercury on the skin, or even using fire to cauterize wounds. These treatments, while they might have been well-meaning, were more likely to harm than heal. Historians still argue whether the plague doctor's role was truly effective or just symbolic. On the one hand, they were trying to keep a lid on the spread of an unprecedented and deadly disease. On the other hand, their actual impact on controlling the plague was minimal. They were often viewed as figures of authority, but their remedies and practices weren't scientifically backed, and they often had little success in saving their patients. Still, these doctors represented the best attempt at combating the disease with the limited knowledge they had. The grim irony is that while they tried to protect themselves and their patients, the plague still spread rapidly, often killing those very doctors who were trying to treat the afflicted. Another aspect of the plague doctor's role was their connection to death. They were, in many cases, the ones to pronounce the ill as dead when they no longer showed any signs of life. In a time when plague victims often died very quickly, the plague doctor would often be the first to pronounce death. Their presence was tied to a finality that people couldn't avoid. While many of the afflicted were left to their own devices, often abandoned by their families for fear of infection, the plague doctor was a figure who could give the family closure, though it came at the cost of their own safety. Most plague doctors had to deal with the moral and physical toll of being constantly exposed to deadly diseases while offering no real cure. The toll on the psyche of these individuals must have been immense. Interestingly, the plague doctor's role wasn't just tied to disease. They were also linked to social control. During outbreaks of the plague, governments would often employ doctors to maintain order, quarantine affected areas, and even help maintain the public's morale. In some cases, plague doctors were paid for their services, but in many instances, they were also compensated with food, lodging, or a place in a community, sometimes simply to have their services available when necessary. They could also issue certificates that confirmed whether someone had died from the plague or from something else, which had its own social and economic implications during the time. As the centuries wore on, the plague doctor's role began to fade as medical knowledge advanced and diseases like the plague were better understood. Today, the plague doctor's eerie appearance is mainly a symbol of medieval ignorance, superstition, and the lengths people went to in trying to understand and conquer disease. While these doctors were pioneers in their own right, they were hampered by the lack of science available to them, and the devastating nature of the plague served as a harsh reminder of how little people knew about infectious diseases at the time. Looking back on the role of the plague doctor, it's clear that their job was both tragic and heroic in its own right. They represented hope in a time of despair, even though they couldn't save the people they treated. They were symbols of society's struggle with illness and the human drive to fight against forces beyond their understanding. The fact that they took on this profession, despite the grave risks to their own lives, shows just how deeply people were willing to engage with the unknown in order to save others. So, the next time you see that iconic plague doctor mask in a Halloween store or historical context, take a moment to reflect on the complexity of their role. They weren't just frightening figures. They were the closest thing medieval society had to a healthcare professional in the face of overwhelming disease. A reminder of both the bravery and the tragic helplessness of a time when death came too swiftly, and the answers to stopping it were still hidden in the dark. As we leave behind the haunting image of the plague doctor, let's move on to another fascinating medieval profession that was equally tied to the darkness of the past, but with a far more down-to-earth task: the candle maker. While it might sound like a quaint, peaceful job, the reality of being a candle maker in medieval Europe was far from easy. These artisans weren't just crafting flickering lights for the home. They were responsible for illuminating the night, a crucial task in a world without electric lighting or even reliable street lamps. Imagine a medieval town with cobblestone streets, wooden houses, and the low murmur of evening activity. As the sun sets and darkness falls, the lights in homes and taverns begin to flicker on, casting long shadows. What's illuminating those spaces? The humble candle, made from tallow, animal fat, or beeswax, was the primary source of artificial light, and the candle maker was the unsung hero who kept the flame burning. The candle maker was an essential profession, especially in towns that operated after sunset. These individuals had to possess a keen knowledge of materials and techniques. It wasn't just about molding wax and sticking a wick into it. There was an art to creating a long-lasting candle, one that burned efficiently and didn't leave behind a foul odor. The two most common types of candles used in medieval Europe were tallow candles, made from animal fat, often from cows or sheep, and beeswax candles, which were far superior but also much more expensive. For the average person, tallow candles were the go-to choice because they were cheaper to make. However, tallow was notorious for producing a nasty smell when burned, not to mention that it produced soot, which would quickly fill a room. It also wasn't the best choice for quality or durability. In contrast, beeswax candles were cleaner, burned brighter, and were far less likely to leave a residue. But these candles were a luxury, often reserved for the wealthy, the nobility, and the church. In fact, beeswax was so prized that the best quality candles, often used in religious ceremonies or lit in churches, were made exclusively from it. Candle makers worked with a variety of materials depending on what they could access. Tallow, while messy and unpleasant, was a relatively cheap and abundant source of fat. In fact, some candle makers even had to slaughter their own livestock to collect enough fat for the candles. The fat would be boiled down to remove impurities, then cooled and shaped into molds. It was a labor-intensive process, and the candle maker's hands would often be covered in sticky, smelly residue. The process wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The role of the candle maker was vital to the functioning of everyday life in medieval towns and cities. The candles they produced weren't just for lighting a room. They were used in religious ceremonies, for heating, and sometimes even for medicinal purposes. For instance, candles were often used in ritualistic practices. Light, in medieval European thought, had spiritual significance, and candles would be lit during prayers or used to ward off evil spirits. In many ways, candle makers weren't just craftsmen. They were also spiritual providers, helping to maintain a connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. Interestingly, the job of the candle maker also involved an element of alchemy, especially when it came to adding scents or colors to their candles. While not as glamorous as the work of a medieval apothecary, candle makers would often experiment with different herbs, spices, and oils to add fragrance to their candles. Lavender, rosemary, and rose petals were commonly used, as were more exotic materials like frankincense or myrrh. The addition of these scents made the candles even more valuable, as they could be used in homes or churches not only for their light, but also for their pleasant smell. Candles also had a very practical side in medieval life. You might not think of it as such, but the invention of the candle and its widespread use allowed for the extension of daily activities beyond the daylight hours. Without candles, the dark winter nights would have meant that people could only do so much. Candlelight allowed craftsmen to work late into the night, families to read or sew by candlelight, and inns to stay open longer for their customers. In short, candles were not just about illumination. They were a necessary part of the rhythm of daily life. Despite the importance of their work, candle makers were often seen as somewhat lowly in society. Much like blacksmiths, tanners, and other artisans, they worked in close proximity to unpleasant smells and materials, so their trade wasn't often celebrated or respected. It was seen as an essential service, but not one that earned much prestige. That being said, candle makers had their place in the medieval economy. They were highly valued during religious festivals or royal ceremonies, when large amounts of candles were needed for processions, rituals, or in royal courts. The job itself was taxing both physically and mentally. The hours were long, and the candle maker had to work in often dirty conditions. But there was something oddly fulfilling about the trade, especially when you consider that for many people in medieval times, the candle was a luxury. While we take light for granted today, in a time when the sun dictated the rhythm of life, a candle allowed for greater flexibility. It extended the hours of productivity, kept people safe, and lit the way for travelers navigating darkened streets. Interestingly, the profession continued to thrive well into the Renaissance and beyond. With the invention of modern gas and electric lights, however, candles began to lose their role in everyday life. But before then, the craft of candle making was tied to nearly every aspect of medieval life. While today we think of candles as decorative or celebratory objects, medieval candle makers were providing a necessary service, crafting not just a source of light, but a tool for survival. So, the next time you light a candle in your home, take a moment to think about the long history behind that little flickering flame. Medieval candle makers helped light the way during one of the darkest periods of human history, not only with their craft, but with their ability to keep the light of everyday life burning, even when the world outside seemed uncertain and grim. Let's step out of the shadowy world of medieval candle makers and venture into a profession that, despite its rather niche nature, was undeniably important in ensuring the safety and security of medieval societies: the royal taster. You might think this job sounds a bit luxurious, and it definitely came with a certain amount of prestige. After all, who wouldn't want to sample the king's food and drink? But there's a darker, much more dangerous side to this job than you might think. After all, someone had to make sure that the king or queen wasn't poisoned. In an age where poisoning was considered one of the most effective and covert ways to assassinate someone, the role of the royal taster became a necessity. Now, when you imagine a royal taster, you probably picture a servant who, with impeccable taste, sits at the royal table, carefully inspecting the meal for flavor and quality. However, the true job of the taster was far more life and death than that. The royal taster's primary role wasn't to critique the seasoning or texture of the food, it was to test it. This person's job was to eat or drink the food or beverage before it was served to the monarch, in the hopes of ensuring that the meal wasn't laced with poison. The existence of royal tasters goes back centuries, even beyond the medieval period to ancient Rome. But during medieval times, when royal courts were rife with intrigue and assassination attempts were common, the need for tasters was more pressing than ever. Kings and queens, surrounded by political enemies, court rivals, and ambitious nobles, needed to be extremely cautious about their food. Poison was a favorite weapon for those who wanted to bypass the protection of guards and servants and take out someone in power with minimal effort. The role of the taster, therefore, became an indispensable part of the court's security system. A royal taster would sit at the table with the king or queen, sometimes alongside other high-ranking officials, and sample the food and drink before anyone else. If the taster didn't collapse or die from poisoning within a reasonable amount of time, the food would be deemed safe to serve to the monarch. If the taster did collapse, well, that's where things got dramatic. But it wasn't as glamorous as it might sound. The job of a royal taster could be a death sentence. Imagine eating a bite of a carefully prepared meal, knowing that it could be the last thing you ever taste. These individuals put their lives on the line every single time they sat down to eat with the royal family. They weren't just tasting food. They were literally gambling with their lives to protect those they served. The taster's work wasn't limited to just food. They also had to test drinks, which were sometimes even more dangerous than food. The idea that poison could be slipped into a goblet of wine or ale was a very real fear. So, the taster would drink a sip of the royal wine or ale, ensuring that it was safe to drink. In some cases, if there was a suspected plot to poison the ruler, multiple tasters might be used, especially if the potential poisons were difficult to detect or took longer to show symptoms. Even though the royal taster was often at high risk, the position came with some distinct perks. Assuming they survived, they were rewarded with a steady salary, access to fine food and drink, and a place in the royal court. This wasn't the kind of job that people would fight over in large numbers, though. It was not for the faint of heart, and there were certainly few volunteers for such a hazardous task. However, it's worth noting that some tasters became quite skilled in detecting subtle poisons, either by taste, smell, or the slight changes they'd notice in texture. They became experts in detecting what shouldn't be there, developing a kind of intuition about which foods or drinks were safe and which weren't. And here's an interesting tidbit. Some royal tasters became well known in history, even gaining reputations beyond their work. They were, at times, trusted confidants of the royal family, but in other cases, they were just part of the background, living in the shadow of their dangerous profession. They often lived in relative obscurity, knowing that their survival depended on their ability to stay out of the spotlight while constantly being exposed to danger. Despite the seeming luxury of their work, historians still debate how many royal tasters actually died performing their duties. The idea of tasters being poisoned is very romanticized in literature and folklore, but it's unclear how often it truly happened. It's certainly plausible that royal poisoning attempts were a regular occurrence, especially among paranoid monarchs, but whether tasters died frequently or not remains uncertain. In fact, many royals likely took measures to protect their tasters by testing their food for poison in ways that might have made it harder to succeed with a plot. However, there's another angle to this profession, the question of trust. If the taster lived long enough, could they be trusted with their life? More often than not, a taster would have to maintain an unshakable loyalty to their monarch. But what if the monarch was a tyrant or someone with enemies everywhere? Could the taster ever really be safe? And what happened when a taster was forced to participate in the assassination of a ruler they once swore to protect? Some historians have speculated that, in a society where court politics could become life or death, these tasters sometimes ended up as unwitting participants in the very intrigues they were supposed to prevent. As the medieval period waned and the Renaissance took shape, the role of the royal taster began to fade. With the advancement of food preservation methods and an increased understanding of poisons, kings and queens no longer had to rely on these brave individuals. But for centuries, the royal taster was a critical figure in the protection of power, constantly walking the fine line between life and death. They embodied the tension of court life, a reminder of how fragile a ruler's position could be and how deeply paranoia and fear shaped even the most opulent and powerful courts. So, the next time you enjoy a glass of wine or bite into a delicious meal, remember the incredible courage of the royal taster. The luxury of eating and drinking in peace and safety today might not have been so guaranteed in a time when poison could be hidden in every dish. The royal taster, a figure shrouded in mystery and danger, once stood between the monarch and a quiet, poisoned end. As we wind down our journey through the bizarre, often dangerous jobs of medieval Europe, let's take a moment to explore one last gruesome but essential profession, the tooth puller. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Really? A medieval dentist? And yes, really. This job was about as far from the painless modern dentist chair as you could get. There were no Novocaine, no gentle cleanings, no please open wide, with a soft, soothing voice. Instead, the medieval tooth puller wielded nothing but a pair of rough, iron pliers and a steady hand. And sometimes not even that. Imagine it. You've got a terrible toothache in the heart of a medieval town. The pain is unbearable, and there's no easy fix. You can't pop over to a modern dentist's office for a quick fix. Instead, you'll head to the town's tooth puller, a professional, who's known for being able to yank teeth out of people's heads in exchange for a modest fee. These individuals didn't just pull teeth. They fixed your oral problems the old-fashioned way, by removing the source of the pain, no questions asked. Simple enough, right? The first thing to understand is that tooth pulling was an essential service in medieval society, but not one that was necessarily handled by a medical professional. While some medieval doctors might have performed a tooth extraction, the person who usually dealt with dental issues was a barber surgeon or an itinerant tooth puller. It wasn't uncommon for the two jobs to overlap. After all, a barber surgeon already had the tools necessary for the job, even if they were a bit crude. The average tooth puller was not a trained specialist in oral hygiene or surgery. They were often just someone who knew how to deal with the painful issue of bad teeth. Tooth pulling wasn't just about yanking a tooth out because it was bothering someone. In medieval times, tooth decay, abscesses, and infections were common. And without modern anesthesia, any sort of dental procedure was as painful as it was necessary. So, if someone had a rotting or infected tooth, they'd go to the local tooth puller, who would typically employ the simple method of using a pair of pliers or an iron hook to extract the tooth. No anesthesia, no hygienic tools, just a firm grip and a lot of pain. You can imagine the kind of screams that might have echoed through the streets as teeth were pulled out. If you've ever had a tooth pulled today, you know how much it can hurt. Now imagine that, but with no numbing agents. What made this job even more uncomfortable was the lack of sanitation. In a world without modern medicine or sterilization, the tools used by the tooth puller were often not cleaned between patients. Can you imagine the risk of infection? If someone had a tooth pulled and the tools weren't disinfected, they risked developing a nasty infection or abscess, which could quickly turn deadly without antibiotics. So, while the tooth puller might have provided immediate relief, they were also introducing the risk of further health problems. But despite these risks, the role of the tooth puller was still highly regarded, albeit begrudgingly. The people who filled this role were essential to everyday life, especially for those who couldn't afford the services of a trained physician or couldn't go to the local barber surgeon. The tooth puller was also sought out for issues that went beyond just the obvious physical problems. They often had a reputation for being jacks of all trades, dealing with anything from simple extractions to more complex dental issues. Sometimes, they even served as informal dentists, grinding down broken teeth or helping to relieve pressure caused by abscesses. But don't get too excited. They weren't really solving your dental issues. At best, they were giving you temporary relief. For all their crude methods, tooth pullers weren't without skill. In fact, many became known for being able to pull teeth with a certain precision. Some were highly respected for their ability to perform extractions quickly and with minimal fuss. In a way, the tooth puller was something of a performer. Much like a barber surgeon, their job was to provide a service that demanded physical expertise, but that also required them to act as the social other in town. Much like their colleagues in the barber surgeon profession, the tooth puller was often seen as a little rough around the edges. They didn't have the formal education that physicians did, but they had a kind of street-smart, practical knowledge that served them well in the medieval world. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of medieval tooth pulling. Did it do more harm than good? Or were these tooth pullers genuinely offering a service that helped alleviate a major problem in people's lives? It's hard to say, given the lack of evidence or records from the time, but the practice was undoubtedly a common solution for many suffering from tooth-related issues. And while it wasn't pleasant, it was the only option available for a long time. In fact, the tooth puller's role eventually evolved and is still a part of modern dentistry, albeit with a few, many improvements. By the time the Renaissance rolled around and the science of dentistry advanced, the tooth puller's role began to be absorbed by more formalized professions, like dentists. But before that, the medieval tooth puller played an important role in society, providing a much-needed service in a world without modern healthcare. Imagine for a moment the tooth puller's life, standing in a crowded marketplace or street corner, ready to pull teeth from anyone who asked, at any time. There were no appointments, no sterile conditions, just an open-air clinic where people came to find relief, and often left with more than just a missing tooth. They may have left with a nasty infection, but hey, at least they didn't have a toothache anymore. So, next time you visit a modern dentist, maybe you'll think about how lucky you are. No one is yanking your teeth out with iron pliers today, thankfully. And while we might grumble about dental procedures, we can thank the medieval tooth pullers for helping us get to a place where relief is less terrifying and a lot more comfortable.